Hi, my name is Julia Luna. Today I'll be showing the Law Day Part 3, the Armenian Genocide, Yesterday, Today, and Impacts for the Future. Today I'll be showing you a 17-minute video about the Armenian Genocide and today and what impacts for the future.
The Armenian Republic eventually became a virtue, but it was born out of necessity and not of desire. It was an imposition, compelled, in the worst possible historical moment for the Armenian people, under the worst possible circumstances, after the annihilation of the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire, hundreds of thousands of refugees, not only from the Ottoman Armenian provinces, but also what was then Russian Armenia, Kars, Surmalu, the place, parts of the plain of Ararat. So it was a mass of people, unprotected, no food, no shelter. And it's at that moment that independence was dictated to the Armenians by the collapse of the Transcaucasian Federation, by the independence of declaration of Georgia, by the separation of Azerbaijan, and the Armenians had no choice. It was not their desire. They had desired, both in the Ottoman Empire and in the Russian Empire, local self-government and autonomy. They had never publicly declared in favor of independence. It didn't seem realistic. And in particular, in the Caucasus, it did not seem realistic because it was hopelessly intertwined with nationalities living everywhere in Baku, Yerevan, Tbilisi, Tiflis, ethnic groups. You could not draw clean boundaries without having a very large minority populations within those. And so the Armenian leadership, those who were thinking about these things, we're talking about cantons or regions within the Caucasus, which where one group or another might be dominant. But with the collapse of the Transcaucasian Federation and with the Turkish armies in control now of Kars, Alexandropol, which is now Gumri, and many other areas, the Armenian leadership, which was not even in what became the Armenian capital of Yerevan, but which was in Tiflis. Tiflis was the Armenian economic, cultural, political center. And it was not easy for the Armenian leadership, the political and economic leadership, to abandon Tiflis, to abandon the wonderful mansions on Solovaki quarter, the mansions on Bolovinsky Prospect, today Rustaveli, to leave this wonderful city and to go to a third-rate, dusty town with nothing but misery in it. So you can imagine how difficult it had to have been for the Armenian leaders to try to form a government and then to move to Yerevan. And when they did move to Yerevan, having no resources whatsoever to try to sustain hundreds of thousands of dependent refugees. And the first prime minister of Armenia, whose name was Hovhannes Khachesnuni, described it as, in Armenian, ansev chaos, chaos without form, chaos without boundaries. That was what was inherited by the Armenians in this very small territory. We must remember that it was only about 8 or 10,000 square kilometers around the town of Yerevan and Lake Savan. That was all that the Armenian Republic started with. Eventually, after the end of World War I, after the defeat of the Turkish Empire, they were able to expand back to the Ararat Plain and to cars, and where they could have some breathing room, perhaps. But throughout the history of the Armenian Republic, it was a contrast between aspirations and ideals on the one hand, and harsh reality on the other hand. The Armenian leaders had grown up in the Russian and European socialist context. And so it was not a surprise that they should declare a republic rather than another form of government. And it was not a surprise that they should adopt the cabinet system of government, in which the prime minister would be answerable to the parliament. And a parliament is elected, and in fact, they did have the first Armenian election in its Armenian history, a popular election. And it's not a surprise that the electoral laws called for all citizens 18 years of age, regardless of ethnicity, religion, and gender, sex, to have the right to vote. And when you think about many of the Western countries not even having women vote until many years later, in the very first Armenian elections in 1919, women had the right to vote, and 3 women were actually in the first Armenian parliament. Now, what does that mean? It means, again, this dedication to an ideal. Probably it didn't, probably there was corruption, probably it wasn't a fair election, I don't know, but the point is that they were aspiring to what it was that they had learned in the international arena, socialist arena. So those 2 years were very, very difficult. And in the very first winter of 1918, 1919, hundreds of thousands of people died of starvation, of famine, exposure. And if you remember, there were worldwide influenza epidemic, which took away thousands of people. And so it was not a joyous country, and especially for the division within the Armenians, so those from the Ottoman Empire and those from the Russian Empire, having quite different cultures, and now having been pushed together into a small space. And the Western Armenians, that is, those of the Turkish Armenians, considering themselves far more patriotic and nationalistic than the Russian Armenians. But they continued to seek, and for that you give them credit. In the very first year, they were able to get back on their feet with the help of American aid. And in each of the departments or ministries, there were very small progress. And what do you expect? After all, in 1 year, you can't have everything, but there was hope for the future. And that is where I think the strength of those dedicated leaders, not necessarily very expert trained diplomats, not necessarily expertly trained in each of their fields, but they did develop in each of the ministries progressive ideas. For example, in the Ministry of Justice, to introduce, as in the Georgian case, the whole hierarchy of local courts to appellate courts, to a Senate, which is a Supreme Court, and most of all, a trial by jury. And it was really funny. The first Armenian trial by jury done in the Armenian language, because as you know, throughout the Caucasus, the official language was Russian, and everyone wrote, and all the ministries operated in Russian. And so here we are having a trial by jury in which the lawyers are looking for Armenian terms or having to create Armenian terms in order to do this. And so there was, in the Department of Labor, putting on the ideal of 8-hour workday, no child labor, and other kinds of protection for guarantee of the life of the workers. How much that was implemented is really another question. I doubt that it went very far, but it shows where they wanted to go. And as in the Georgian case as well, and I'm sorry I didn't hear about Azerbaijan, but education became the sort of the rock for the future. And emphasis was placed by the ministers of education on universal elementary education, separation of church and state, because Armenians had only parochial schools up until that time. And now to have secular education, universal secular education, adult reading, literacy classes, doubling the number of schools and students in 1 year. That's impressive. And most of all, reaching, even in those very difficult times, the ability to open the first Armenian university in history, with 4 faculties, and only probably 200 or 300 students, but it was the ideal. So it was, the Republic of Armenia was, as I say, the harsh, difficult realities on the ground, which probably prevented many of the inhabitants from feeling that they were living in a very independent, happy place, because it wasn't very happy. But there was a goal for the future in the Department of Agriculture. Meteorological, mineral, agricultural, veterinarian, all of these bodies were formed. And if these republics had endured, I have no doubt that they would have gone a long way to achieving those ideals. It didn't happen. Armenia was stuck in a very unfavorable geographic position, as was the Caucasus, if you want to think in terms of independence, with Russia on one side and Turkey on the other, with continuous border difficulties with their neighbors, because, as I said, there was no clear demarcation line. When people say this is mine and that is yours, no, the Caucasus belonged really to quite everyone, and it was a shame that nationalism, in many ways, undid the cosmopolitanness of the Caucasus. So at best I can say the Republic was a heroic ideal that only began to demonstrate and to implement those ideals, and was let down actually by the great powers in the West, which had promised them so much during the genocide, that they would be rehabilitated, that they would have a free life for themselves, that they would be protected, you know, and the irony is that didn't happen. And perhaps the great allied powers were right, that the Caucasus has to belong in the Russian sphere, and why should we waste our time, energy, soldiers in trying to help Menshevik Georgia, Tashnag Armenia, when sooner or later they're going to fall under the Russian sphere. Well, it came to pass, partly because of their own doing. And then we went back, and as I said, how difficult it was for the Armenians to transform from Russian language administration to national language. But you know, that was again when I started going to the Soviet Union in the 1960s and 70s, it was again the same. The bureaucracy was all Russian speaking, and everything had to be written and sent on to Moscow in Russian and never in the national language, even though they could speak to each other in the national language. So here we are, back at independence once again. And probably someone mentioned, and that's the first republic, however difficult their conditions, however great their rivalries, they were still speaking to one another. They were still having regional conferences of Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis. They still had diplomatic relations, however strained those diplomatic relations were with all three countries. And, you know, hopefully we'll get back to that day once again.
That's the end of that video. And these are the three questions we'll be talking about today. The first question would be, what were the conditions of Armenia after World War I? Well, after World War I, it was barely being put together, in my opinion, and because it had been broken down and separated and everything. For question 2, how did Turkey and Russia influence Armenia after World War I? People had got jealous after World War I and wanted their own territory, so everything separated. Why should we study this period of time, and how has that impacted Armenia today? We should study this period of time because this period of time in Armenia was important, and this is how everyone came together and everything separated. And it impacted Armenia today because Armenia would not be Armenia today without this. And that'll be all.
We are going to discuss Armenia after World War I.
What were the conditions of Armenia after World War I?
Armenia's army unfortunately can't resist the Communist armies, and most of their lands were grabbed by Mustafa Kemal. In the end, Armenia accepted the demand of Soviet Russia and allowed it to be declared a Soviet Socialist Republic. How did Turkey and Russia influence Armenia after World War I?
After Armenia was attacked by the Communist armies, they had to sue for peace because much of what belonged to Armenia was grabbed. Armenia was occupied by Russia and Turkey, and it was tragic for Armenia. However, it had also brought about a good deal of good, in culture, education, and technology in Armenian modern history. Why should we study this period of time and how has that impacted Armenia today?
This period of time, Armenia after World War II, was when Armenia was erupted by the Soviet Union and became the Soviet Socialist Republic in 1920. From 1921 until 1991, the Soviet Armenian history impacted present day Armenia's culture, education, technology, and industry. Thank you.